In the summer of 1546, a harrowing spectacle unfolded. A young woman, Anne Askew, was carried to her death in a chair, her body irrevocably broken. The torture she had endured, a brutal application of the rack, was typically reserved for the lowest criminals, yet it had been inflicted upon a woman of noble birth. Despite the agonizing dismemberment and unimaginable pain, she steadfastly refused to betray those who shared her Protestant faith. The events surrounding Anne Askew's life and death paint a chilling portrait of religious persecution in Tudor England, a period where deeply held beliefs could lead to the ultimate sacrifice, and where the state's machinery of terror operated with terrifying efficiency and chilling indifference. Anne Askew lived in an era defined by religious upheaval and stark choices, but the England of her youth was anything but a simple dichotomy of Catholic versus Protestant. Born around 1521 into an affluent family in Lincolnshire, she matured during the volatile years of the Protestant Reformation, King Henry VIII's seismic break with Rome, and his establishment of himself as the supreme head of the Church of England had created a precarious and unpredictable religious landscape. The king's theological leanings were notoriously fickle, shifting unpredictably, leaving the populace in a constant state of uncertainty about what beliefs were deemed acceptable. Powerful Catholic factions still held sway at court, while zealous Protestant reformers pressed for far-reaching changes that would dismantle centuries of religious tradition. Tudor England was a religious minefield where a misstep could lead to devastation and ruin. Henry VIII's audacious defiance of papal authority had unleashed a theological free-for-all, with competing factions vying for dominance, each asserting divine sanction for their particular interpretation of Christian doctrine. The Act of 6 Articles, enacted in 1539, reaffirmed several key Catholic tenets, while simultaneously upholding the king's supremacy over the Pope. The outcome was an incongruous hybrid religion that appeased neither staunch Catholics nor dedicated Protestants, leaving countless believers bewildered about the path to salvation and fearful of the consequences of heresy. Anne Askew possessed a dangerously potent combination in Tudor England: an educated intellect and unwavering convictions. Unusually for women of her time, she was proficient in Latin and had engaged in extensive scriptural study, skills cultivated by her father, recognizing their importance for a woman of her social standing. When her father arranged her marriage to Thomas Kyme, a Catholic who openly opposed her religious views, Anne found herself trapped in a conflict between familial obligation and personal faith. The marriage quickly soured, with theological disputes eclipsing any semblance of domestic harmony. Despite bearing him 2 children, she ultimately made a revolutionary decision that scandalized Tudor society. She abandoned her husband and children to pursue her religious calling in London. This bold act of defiance irrevocably shaped her destiny, underscoring the depth and unshakable nature of her convictions. Anne's decision to leave her family was a radical departure from societal norms in Tudor England, where women were expected to submit unquestioningly to their husband's religious leadership. The legal framework provided no recourse for a woman who prioritized conscience over marital vows. By separating from Thomas Kyme, she relinquished all rights to her children and forfeited much of her property, effectively becoming a religious exile within her own nation. Her actions not only challenged Catholic dogma, but also questioned the entire social hierarchy that placed women firmly under male authority. This act of rebellion against accepted gender roles intensified her subsequent persecution, as authorities viewed her as a threat to both religious and social order. In London's clandestine Protestant circles, Anne quickly garnered recognition as a powerful and articulate theologian and preacher. She fearlessly debated scripture with learned men and openly challenged Catholic doctrines. Her extant writings reveal a keen intellect and an unyielding dedication to Protestant principles. She rejected the Catholic doctrine of transubstantiation, denied the authority of priests to absolve sins, and questioned the veneration of saints. While these beliefs are widely accepted by many Protestants today, they were deemed heretical and punishable by death in Tudor England. Her eloquence and fervent passion attracted followers, but they also drew the unwanted attention of authorities who were becoming increasingly paranoid about religious dissent. The Protestant underground in London was a perilous realm of secret gatherings, concealed books, and coded conversations. Anne navigated this treacherous network with remarkable courage, participating in clandestine services and distributing forbidden religious texts. She corresponded with fellow reformers across England and Europe, creating a trail of incriminating correspondence that would later be used against her. Her residence became a haven for like-minded believers, a sanctuary where prohibited ideas could be openly discussed. But this very openness ultimately contributed to her downfall, as government spies infiltrated Protestant circles with increasing regularity. Anne's ordeal began in 1545 when she was first arrested on charges of heresy. The accusations were severe, distributing banned books and preaching Protestant beliefs. However, they were also strategically framed to assess the extent of her connections to influential patrons. Her associations with powerful Protestant nobles, including Queen Catherine Parr's own sister-in-law, initially provided her with a degree of protection. She was released following interrogation, but the authorities were not finished with her. They suspected that she was part of a more extensive Protestant network that posed a significant threat to the Catholic faction at court. They sought names, and they believed that Anne Askew possessed the key to unraveling the entire conspiracy. The political backdrop of Anne's persecution cannot be ignored. By 1546, the aging Henry VIII was increasingly unpredictable, and various factions were maneuvering for advantage in the looming succession struggle. The Catholic Party, spearheaded by figures such as Stephen Gardiner and Thomas Wriothesley, saw a chance to crush their Protestant adversaries by proving their disloyalty to the crown. If they could demonstrate that Queen Catherine Parr herself was implicated in heresy, they could neutralize the Protestant faction entirely and ensure control over the young Prince Edward's future reign. Her second arrest in June 1546 marked the commencement of a horrific experience that would shock even seasoned Tudor officials. Imprisoned in the Tower of London, Anne was subjected to interrogation by some of the most powerful men in England, including Lord Chancellor Thomas Wriothesley and Sir Richard Rich. These men were not inherently cruel, but they were calculating politicians who regarded Anne as a means to achieve greater political objectives. They demanded that she reveal the identities of other Protestants, particularly those connected to Queen Catherine Parr. The stakes were incredibly high. If they could implicate the Queen in heresy, they could decimate the Protestant faction and reshape English religious identity. The interrogation methods employed against Anne were both psychologically and physically manipulative. Her interrogators were erudite theologians who could challenge her scriptural knowledge, engaging in protracted debates aimed at trapping her in contradictions. They oscillated between threats and enticements, offering her freedom in exchange for cooperation while vividly describing the horrors that awaited her if she remained defiant. They introduced former associates who had already confessed, hoping that peer pressure would erode her resolve. When these tactics failed, they resorted to sleep deprivation and dietary restrictions, weakening her body to make her mind more susceptible. When verbal interrogation failed to break her unwavering spirit, the authorities made a decision unprecedented in English history. For the first time, a woman of noble birth would be subjected to the rack. This decision violated all established social conventions of the time and required explicit authorization from the highest levels of government. The rack was considered beneath the dignity of the nobility, reserved for common criminals and traitors. Yet Anne's refusal to divulge information had driven her interrogators to desperation. They were willing to defy centuries of precedent to extract the information they desired, fully aware that the torture of a noble woman would send tremors of fear throughout English society. The decision to torture Anne was not impulsive or driven by rage, but a carefully calculated political maneuver. Her interrogators understood that news of her treatment would quickly spread throughout Protestant circles, potentially intimidating others into submission. They also mistakenly believed that her gender made her more vulnerable to physical pressure, a misjudgment that exposed their fundamental misunderstanding of her character. The authorization to employ the rack came directly from the king, underscoring the intensity of the religious and political conflicts that characterized the era. The torture chamber in the Tower of London was specifically designed to break both the body and the spirit. The rack itself was a wooden frame, equipped with rollers at each end, operated by levers that stretched the victim's body to unbearable limits. The room was deliberately designed to intimidate, with various instruments of torture prominently displayed to maximize psychological distress even before physical pain commenced. As Anne was secured to the device, she would have observed the pulleys and ropes that would soon tear her joints apart. The psychological torment began before the physical. The anticipation of pain, the knowledge that her body would be systematically destroyed. Yet, even in the face of this instrument of agony, she remained defiant. The rack operated on a simple but devastating principle: the gradual and relentless stretching of the human body beyond its natural limits. The victim was positioned on their back, with wrists and ankles secured to rollers at opposite ends of the wooden frame. As the levers were turned, the rollers moved in opposing directions, pulling the body taut. The pain began as discomfort, escalated to excruciating agony, and culminated in the sickening sound of joints dislocating from their sockets. The process could be halted and restarted, allowing interrogators to alternate between torture and questioning. The victim remained fully conscious throughout, forced to endure not only physical agony, but also the psychological terror of knowing that the torture could resume at any moment. What followed defied every expectation of the Tudor interrogators. As the rack slowly pulled Anne's body apart, dislocating her shoulders, hips, and elbows, she continued to deny their demands. The pain was beyond comprehension. Imagine every joint in your body being wrenched from its socket while you remained conscious. Contemporary witnesses reported that the torture was so extreme that Wriothesley himself took over operating the rack when the professional torturer refused to continue. The Tower's executioner, a man desensitized by years of inflicting pain, was so disturbed by the orders he received that he abandoned his post rather than continue the torture of a woman. The psychological impact on Anne's torturers was as profound as the physical trauma inflicted on her body. Wriothesley, a man accustomed to the brutal realities of Tudor politics, personally operated the rack in a desperate attempt to break her will. Sir Richard Rich, hardened by years of interrogation and execution, was reportedly shaken by Anne's unwavering refusal to yield. These men had broken countless prisoners through torture, but they had never encountered someone who maintained such resolute silence despite such immense suffering. Her defiance challenged their perception of human nature and their confidence in their methods. The technical details of Anne's torture were recorded in disturbing detail by court officials who witnessed the proceedings. The rack was operated in stages, with periods of intense stretching, followed by brief releases that allowed blood to flow back into compressed joints. This technique maximized suffering while preventing the rapid loss of consciousness that might have provided some merciful respite. Between sessions, Anne was returned to her cell, where she was forced to lie motionless as dislocated joints swelled and muscles cramped. The constant pain served as a perpetual reminder of what awaited her if she continued to refuse cooperation. The aftermath of her torture revealed the appalling extent of her injuries. Anne's body was so severely damaged that she could no longer walk or even stand. Her arms hung limply at her sides, her legs unable to bear her weight. In an era devoid of painkillers or adequate medical care, she endured relentless agony that would have driven many to madness. Yet her mind remained lucid and her faith unbroken. From her cell, she continued to write, producing some of the most compelling religious poetry of the Tudor period. Her words, smuggled out of the Tower, inspired other Protestants and demonstrated that her spirit remained unconquered. Anne's writings from the Tower reveal a woman transformed by suffering, but not defeated by it. Her poems speak of physical pain, but also of spiritual triumph, of a body broken, but a soul intact. She wrote of conversations with God in her cell, of visions that sustained her through the darkest hours. These works, secretly circulated among Protestant sympathizers, became powerful propaganda for the Reformation. They demonstrated that even the most brutal persecution could not extinguish true faith, and that the human spirit could transcend physical suffering when sustained by religious conviction. The legal proceedings that followed were a mockery of justice, designed to legitimize a predetermined outcome. Anne was condemned for heresy based on her religious writings and statements, but her true crime in the eyes of her persecutors was her refusal to implicate others. The trial was swift and the verdict predetermined, conducted in a chamber where she had to be supported by attendants because her tortured body could not sit upright. She was sentenced to be burned alive at the stake, the standard punishment for heresy. While this was a horrific fate, Anne faced an additional torment. She would endure the flames while her body remained crippled from torture. The sentencing of Anne Askew was attended by the highest officials of the realm, transforming what should have been a routine heresy trial into a state spectacle. The judges who condemned her were the same men who had authorized her torture, creating a closed system of justice where the accusers, torturers, and judges were one and the same. Her inability to stand during the proceedings served as a stark reminder of the state's power to crush those who opposed it. The sentence was read as she slumped in her chair, her dislocated joints unable to support her body's weight. The weeks between her sentencing and execution were filled with persistent attempts to break her will. Priests visited her cell daily, offering salvation in exchange for confession and recantation. Government officials dangled promises of reprieve if she would name just one fellow Protestant. Even her estranged husband was brought to the tower in the vain hope that family loyalty might succeed where torture had failed. Yet Anne remained steadfast, using these visits to preach her beliefs rather than abandon them. Her unwavering resolve in the face of such pressure astonished even her enemies, who had expected the combination of torture and false hope to destroy her resistance. On July 16, 1546, the final act of this tragedy commenced. Anne had to be carried to Smithfield, London's traditional execution ground, in a chair because her tortured body could not support her weight. The procession through London's streets was unlike any previous heresy execution. Typically, condemned heretics walked to their deaths, sometimes recanting along the way to secure a quicker death. Anne's chair became a mobile pulpit from which she continued preaching, her voice resonating with crowds who had gathered not to celebrate the death of a heretic, but to witness the fate of a woman whose courage had become legendary. The crowd that gathered at Smithfield was unusual in its composition and mood. Heretic burnings typically drew celebratory crowds who viewed the executions as righteous punishment for religious crimes. Anne's execution drew a more somber gathering that included many secret Protestant sympathizers who had come to witness her final moments. Even her enemies acknowledged her extraordinary bravery, with some Catholics present expressing private doubts about the justice of her treatment. The government deployed extra guards, fearing that Protestant supporters might attempt a rescue or that the crowd might turn violent in response to the spectacle. The execution site itself had been meticulously prepared to maximize both the deterrent effect and the efficiency of the killing. The stake was positioned for maximum visibility, with cleared sightlines allowing the largest possible crowd to witness the proceedings. Bundles of wood were arranged to ensure a hot, fast-burning fire that would quickly consume the victim. Yet for Anne, even these preparations took on a grotesque quality, as her broken body had to be lifted from the chair and secured to the stake with extra bindings to prevent her from collapsing prematurely into the flames. The execution itself was intended to be swift and relatively merciful by Tudor standards, though mercy is a stark term when discussing the act of burning someone alive. Sacks of gunpowder were tied around Anne's body, designed to cause rapid explosions that would end her suffering quickly. This was a kindness usually reserved for those who showed repentance or those who had influential friends. Yet even this small mercy became another element of horror. The explosions would tear apart her already broken body while she remained conscious. The gunpowder was positioned at strategic points to ensure the explosions would be fatal, not just agonizing. As the flames engulfed her, Anne Askew faced her final moments with the same courage she had displayed throughout her ordeal. Witnesses reported that she remained conscious longer than most victims, her lips moving in what appeared to be prayer, even as the fire consumed her clothing and charred her skin. The gunpowder explosions, when they came, were so violent that they scattered burning debris across the execution ground, forcing spectators to recoil from the intensity of the blast. Yet even these explosions seemed insufficient to end her suffering quickly, as contemporary accounts describe her continuing to move after the first detonations. The immediate aftermath of Anne's execution revealed the complex emotions her death had stirred throughout London. While government officials celebrated the elimination of a dangerous heretic, many spectators left Smithfield in silence, profoundly disturbed by what they had witnessed. Reports of her extraordinary courage and the unprecedented brutality of her treatment spread rapidly throughout the city. Protestant sympathizers began collecting and preserving her writings, ensuring that her story would endure beyond her death. Even some Catholics expressed private reservations about the decision to torture and execute a woman whose only crime was religious conviction. The The impact of Anne's death reverberated far beyond the execution ground at Smithfield. News of her torture spread throughout Protestant Europe, where it was viewed as evidence of Catholic barbarity and English tyranny. Her writings, preserved and published after her death, inspired generations of reformers who found in her story confirmation that faith could triumph over the worst human cruelty. The fact that she had been tortured, a violation of aristocratic privilege, became a rallying cry for Protestant propagandists who used her story to expose the extremes to which their adversaries would go. Protestant martyrologists, notably John Foxe in his Book of Martyrs, ensured that Anne's story became deeply embedded in the foundational narrative of English Protestantism. Her account was read aloud in churches, inspiring countless believers to maintain their faith in the face of persecution. The stark contrast between her courage and the brutality of her torturers became a potent propaganda tool that helped shape English religious identity for centuries. Her story proved to be especially powerful in the American colonies, where Puritan settlers revered her as an icon of resistance against religious tyranny. The international response to Anne's execution was immediate and vehement. Protestant rulers across Europe condemned the torture of a noble woman as a violation of Christian principles and aristocratic rights. The Holy Roman Emperor, despite his own persecution of Protestants, privately denounced the English methods as excessive and counterproductive. French Protestants exploited her story to highlight the dangers of Catholic dominance, while German reformers integrated her writings into their own theological arguments. Her death caused diplomatic damage for England, harming its reputation across Protestant Europe. Anne Askew's story compels us to confront uncomfortable truths about human nature and the lengths to which individuals will go to defend their beliefs, both as victims and perpetrators. Her torturers were not monsters, but respected officials who genuinely believed they were protecting England from religious chaos. They were convinced that extracting names from Anne could prevent greater bloodshed and maintain social stability. Thomas Wriothesley and Richard Rich were educated men who regularly attended church and considered themselves devout Christians. Yet in their fervent desire to protect their vision of truth, they committed acts that shocked their contemporaries and continue to horrify us today. The bureaucratic system that enabled Anne's torture demonstrates how easily institutional evil can flourish when individuals relinquish moral responsibility to higher authorities. Each official involved in her persecution could point to orders from above, creating a framework where no one felt personally accountable for the ultimate outcome. The guards who carried her to the rack, the clerks who documented her responses, the judges who condemned her were all components of a system that dispersed moral culpability so broadly that it seemed to vanish entirely. This diffusion of responsibility allowed ordinary people to participate in extraordinary cruelty while maintaining their self-image as moral beings. The methods used against Anne, including torture, public execution, and the intentional infliction of suffering, were considered acceptable instruments of statecraft in the 16th century. Her story reminds us of how recently such practices were not only accepted, but celebrated by those in power. The crowds who gathered to witness executions were not necessarily bloodthirsty. They were participating in what their society defined as justice. This normalization of cruelty reveals how readily civilized societies can descend into barbarism when fear and ideology trump basic human compassion. The religious justifications for Anne's treatment underscore the dangerous potential of absolute certainty in matters of faith. Both her persecutors and her supporters claimed divine authority for their actions, leading to a situation where compromise became impossible and violence inevitable. The Catholic officials who tortured her sincerely believed they were saving souls and preserving societal order. Anne herself was equally convinced that her beliefs were divinely inspired and worth any sacrifice. This clash of absolute certainties resulted in a human tragedy that benefited no one and left enduring scars on English society. Perhaps most disturbingly, Anne's gender was weaponized against her. The decision to torture a noble woman was shocking precisely because it defied societal conventions about how women should be treated. Yet those same conventions made her torture more sensational and, in the minds of her persecutors, more likely to break her will. They assumed that a woman's body, deemed more fragile than a man's, would succumb more readily to physical agony. They also believed that her maternal instincts would make her more inclined to confess in order to protect other women and children within the Protestant community. Their miscalculation reveals both their underestimation of human resilience and their willingness to exploit what they perceived as feminine weakness. The legal precedents established during Anne's prosecution cast a long shadow over English jurisprudence for generations. The use of torture on a noble woman, the extension of heresy laws to private religious discussions, and the acceptance of evidence obtained through extreme duress all marked significant departures from traditional English legal practice. These innovations, rationalized as emergency measures to safeguard religious and political stability, became part of the legal toolkit available to future tyrants. Anne's case demonstrated how rapidly legal protections could be dismantled when authorities felt sufficiently threatened. Anne's refusal to name names, even under the most extreme torture, challenges us to contemplate what we would do in similar circumstances. She had every conceivable reason to speak. The torture was unbearable, her cause seemed doomed, and silence would only prolong her agony. The individuals she protected by her silence were not necessarily close friends or family members, but fellow believers she had encountered within London's Protestant underground. Yet, she chose to protect these relative strangers at the cost of unimaginable suffering. Her decision raises profound questions about loyalty, sacrifice, and the price of conscience. The psychological mechanisms that allowed Anne to endure such suffering remain enigmatic even today. Modern research on trauma and torture suggests that most individuals break under far less pressure than she withstood. Her capacity to maintain silence despite extreme physical and psychological torture appears to have relied on a combination of unwavering religious faith, profound personal conviction, and perhaps a rare ability to dissociate from physical pain. Her writing suggests that she experienced her suffering as a form of communion with Christ's passion, transforming agony into a spiritual experience that strengthened rather than weakened her resolve. The practical consequences of Anne's silence were significant for both her persecutors and the Protestant community. Her refusal to provide names prevented the dismantling of the Protestant network surrounding Queen Catherine Parr, allowing the Protestant faction to survive and eventually flourish under Edward VI. Her torturers, having invested immense political capital in her interrogation, were left empty-handed and vulnerable to criticism from their own allies. The failure to break her spirit became a propaganda victory for Protestants and a lasting source of embarrassment for the Catholic faction at court. So, as we've explored the story of Anne Askew, it's clear that her life, though tragically cut short, stands as a powerful testament to the strength of conviction in the face of unimaginable cruelty. Her unwavering faith and courage in the face of torture remind us of the profound cost of religious persecution and the enduring power of the human spirit to resist oppression. It's a story that truly stays with you, prompting us to consider the values we hold dear and the lengths to which we would go to defend them. What are your thoughts on Anne Askew's story? Does it inspire you, challenge you, or perhaps even make you question your own beliefs? I'd love to hear your perspective in the comments below. Feel free to share your reflections, ask any questions you may have, or join the conversation. This is a complex and fascinating period in history, and I always learn so much from your insights. And if you found this exploration of Anne Askew's life thought-provoking, please consider subscribing to the channel. That way, you won't miss out on future deep dives into history's most compelling figures and events. Thanks for watching.